Hello, friends, and let's get started.
When Rachel and I got married, we moved to Boston, a city she adored for its atmosphere and rhythm of life. Our first year in Boston was a blur of happiness. We lived in a small but cozy apartment in an old brick house. We spent our evenings walking along the Charles River waterfront, talking about our dreams. Our nights were filled with passion and tenderness. Rachel was a woman who attracted attention with her openness and charm. She loved to laugh, and her laughter could instantly improve any mood. I admired her ability to turn even the most mundane things into special moments. But, as is often the case, the everyday began to slowly invade our little world. It started with the little things. Rachel started staying longer at work. Her once easy gait became increasingly heavy when she walked home, carrying a visible fatigue with her. Over time, Rachel began to apologize for her delays at work. At first, her words sounded natural, like someone who was truly overworked. "I'm sorry I'm so late. Today was a hell of a day. A confusing report. A client threw a tantrum," she'd say as she took her shoes off in the hallway. At first, I took her apology at face value. Her job was really stressful, and I understood how exhausting it could be. But then something started to change. Her voice sounded too steady, as if she had rehearsed her words beforehand. She avoided my gaze, her movements becoming machine-like. Instead of hugging me or telling me how her day was going, she slumped tiredly on the couch, pulling out her phone. "Don't you want anything? Tea? Dinner?" I asked once, watching her absent-mindedly scrolling through something on the screen. "No thanks. I just want to rest," Rachel replied. One night when I made her favorite pasta, she simply said, "Thanks, I'll eat later. I'm not hungry." She left for the bedroom, leaving me alone at the table again. That moment stuck in my mind like a splinter. I tried to do something about it. I planned a weekend away together, suggested a trip to the seaside, even gave her flowers for no reason. Rachel smiled, but it was the smile of someone trying to be polite. "You're so thoughtful," she said once, kissing me on the cheek, but there was no sincerity in her voice. Every night, the same scenario repeated itself between us. After dinner, I tried to get closer to Rachel, to hug her, to kiss her, to feel some of the tenderness we'd had before. But every time she found a reason to pull away. "I'm sorry, I'm tired," she said, moving to the edge of the bed. "I had so much to do today," she explained another time, pulling the comforter up to her chin. "We have to get up early tomorrow. Let's get some sleep," she said, turning away from the wall. These words became routine. At first, I took them for truth. Indeed, her job was stressful, and I tried to be understanding. But as time went on, these excuses began to sound the same, like pre-prepared lines. The real blow came late in the evening when I found her in the living room. She was sitting on the couch with her laptop. Her face was focused, but it read something more: tension, hidden anxiety. I quietly walked over and sat down next to her. "Hi," I said, putting my hand on her shoulder. She flinched, as if she hadn't expected my touch. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying not to make a big deal out of it. "Nothing, just tired," she replied, closing the laptop as quickly as if there was something I shouldn't see. Her "nothing" had become familiar. I knew there was something more behind the word, but she wouldn't let me get any closer. One day, I decided to directly ask her to spend the evening alone. "Rachel, why don't we have dinner? Watch an old movie and have some fun in our bed?" I suggested with flirtation in my voice, trying to sound carefree. She looked at me with a slight chuckle, but there was detachment in her eyes. "Why? Maybe you should go out with your friends. You need a distraction, don't you?" Her words cut me like a knife. Why doesn't she want to spend time with me anymore? Weren't we the ones who always chose each other? I retreated to the bedroom, but I couldn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, questions swirling in my head. What had changed? Why did her tenderness, her warmth seem to have vanished into thin air? After a few months of my unsuccessful attempts, I decided to change tactics. The day began as usual. The cold silence at breakfast, the detached "see you tonight," and the sound of the door closing behind Rachel. But this time, something was different inside me. I was tired of trying, or rather I was just sick of it. The evenings filled with her rejections and strained smiles had become too much of a burden. I made a decision. No more initiatives on my part. I got home a little later than usual that night. Rachel was already sitting on the couch, staring at her phone. Instead of trying to make conversation or put my arm around her, I silently walked to the kitchen to heat up dinner. "Have you eaten yet?" Her voice came from the living room, a little surprised. "No, just hungry," I answered calmly, trying not to show my new approach. I sat down at the table, eating slowly, wondering if she'd noticed the difference. But she kept flipping through something on the screen, not even looking up. The next morning, I again did nothing. Instead of the usual, "You look beautiful," as she was getting ready for work, I just nodded and went about my business. She gave me a glimpse, as if expecting to hear something more, but I didn't give her that pleasure. A few days passed before I noticed the first shift. One evening, sitting at my laptop, I felt her hand hesitantly touch my shoulder. "Don't you want to watch a movie together?" she asked, her voice sounding softer than usual. I glanced at her, inwardly pleased but outwardly calm. "Maybe later," I answered. Her smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. She shrugged and retreated to her bedroom. Over the next few days, her attempts became more noticeable. She began to find reasons to be around me more often. Dinner conversations came alive again, but this time the initiative came from her. One evening, I decided to complicate the experiment. Rachel approached me again with the movie, but now her hand lingered on my shoulder a little longer. "I miss our evenings," she said quietly, her eyes meeting mine. "I do too," I answered briefly, not giving any more than I needed to. She stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to figure out what had changed. Then her face took on a determined expression, and she leaned closer. "Shall we start over?" she asked, almost in a whisper. Something inside me clenched. I wanted to hug her, to tell her I'd dreamed of it, but I held back. Instead, I smiled softly and nodded. The next day, she took another step. When I got home, dinner was already on the table. The smell of freshly made pasta filled the kitchen, and Rachel greeted me with a smile I hadn't seen in months. "I thought you'd be hungry," she said, sliding my plate over to me. "Thank you," I replied simply, feeling the game picking up. I wasn't going to give up so quickly, though. As the evening wore on, her touch became more confident, almost insistent. "Why don't we put the phones away tonight?" she suggested, her hand resting on my chest. I looked at her and, barely holding back a smile, said, "Sorry, I'm tired today. Let's just watch the show." Her face froze, reflecting both confusion and annoyance for a moment. "Tired?" she asked, pulling away. "Yes," I answered calmly. She went silently into the bedroom, and I stayed on the couch, feeling my efforts begin to pay off. The next day, she made another attempt. We had dinner in silence until she suddenly spoke. "I think we should spend the weekend together. Just the two of us, no work, no phones." "That's an interesting idea," I replied, pretending to weigh her suggestion. Rachel looked at me carefully, waiting for an answer, but I didn't give her any more than that. Her patience was beginning to wear thin. After a few more days, her attempts became more noticeable. She did everything to get my attention. She bought my favorite foods, changed her style of dress, even spent an entire evening discussing my hobbies. One night, when she finally decided to make a direct move, her words sounded like a confession. "I want to make things right and spend time with you in our bedroom," she said, her eyes filled with real pain. I fell silent, feeling her words penetrate deep inside. My heart clenched, but my learning experiment wasn't over yet. It had started with nothing. Rachel walked into the living room, where I was sitting on the couch with my laptop. She stood at the door, her arms crossed over her chest and a flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Are you going to sit like that all night?" she asked with sudden abruptness. I looked up, trying to remain calm. "What do you suggest?" Her face tensed, as if she were fighting an inner urge. "How about we spend some time together? In our bed? You've been distant lately," she said, taking a step closer. I felt the tension in the room begin to rise. It was something I'd been preparing for, but also something I'd been dreading. "I wasn't distancing myself, Rachel. I was just giving you the space you seem to want so badly." Her eyes narrowed and she stepped closer, her tone sharper. "Space? You call this space? You act like I don't exist for you anymore." I closed the laptop and slowly got up from the couch. "You started this," I said quietly but firmly. Rachel was silent for a second, her hands falling along her body, but her gaze remained intense. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling, but it was clear she was already guessing. Months. Months I've been trying. I've done everything I could to get us back to where we were before. But you kept finding reasons to stay away. I spoke calmly, but I could feel the storm building up inside. Rachel exhaled sharply, like she was trying to suppress her excitement. It's not fair, she whispered, taking another step toward me. What isn't? I asked, trying to keep control. You're punishing me? You're doing this on purpose to show me how wrong I was. I felt her accusations pierce through my armor. Her words were close to the truth, but I wasn't going to give up so easily. Of course I want you to understand what it's like to feel rejected, I said without averting my gaze. Her eyes widened, and a mixture of anger and hurt lit up in them. You think this is going to help? You think it's going to fix anything? She raised her voice, her words sounding like gunshots. I opened my mouth to reply, but she interrupted me. You're not even trying. You're just playing your games, and she stammered, her voice trailing off. I saw her hand go to my phone, which was on the table. This is what you really care about, she shouted, grabbing it. Rachel, put the phone down. I took a step forward, but she stepped back, her eyes burning with anger. This is what's destroying everything. She raised the phone above her head, and before I could say anything, she threw it against the wall. The sound of the screen shattering sounded like thunder. We both froze. Her chest heaved, her eyes glistening with tears. I looked at the shards that had scattered across the floor and back at her. She looked like she couldn't believe what she'd just done. You want to talk about destruction? I said, feeling my composure start to crack. It's not all my fault, she shouted, her voice shaking with tension. You're right, I replied after a pause. But you haven't given me a single chance to fix it. Her shoulders slumped, and she turned away. For a few seconds we stood in silence, listening only to our heavy breathing. I don't know how we got to this point, she finally said, her voice weak, almost a whisper. I wanted to say something back, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just watched her slowly walk out of the room, leaving me alone amidst the broken glass. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. The room was quiet, with only a faint light coming through the thick curtains. Rachel was sleeping on the edge of the bed, her face turned toward the wall. Even in her sleep, she seemed tense, as if she were carrying an invisible weight. I stared at her for a long time, trying to figure out what was left of the woman I loved so much. I got up, trying not to wake her, and went into the kitchen. The coffee didn't bring the usual relief, and its bitter taste only emphasized the emptiness inside. The shards of my phone were still on the table, a reminder of last night. I slowly picked them up, trying not to cut myself, but the feeling that something couldn't be fixed was only growing stronger. The entire day passed in silence. We hardly spoke at all, avoiding each other like strangers. Her footsteps in the house sounded louder than usual. Her every breath seemed like a rebuke. By evening, I realized I couldn't live like this anymore. When Rachel returned from the supermarket, I was waiting for her in the living room. She put the bags on the kitchen table and stopped in the doorway when she saw my serious expression. We need to talk, I said. She nodded silently, walking slowly to the chair across from me. Her face remained impassive, but I knew she was seething inside. I don't think we can continue, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. Her eyes instantly filled with tension. What are you trying to say? She asked, but her voice shook. I sighed, gathering my thoughts. Our relationship, it's not what it was anymore. We're not happy with each other anymore, and I don't think I can feel that way again. Rachel stood up abruptly, as if my words had hit her. Are you serious? After everything we've been through, you're just going to throw it all away? Her anger didn't surprise me. I was ready for it. I don't want us to keep torturing each other, I said without averting my gaze. She started pacing the room, her hands clenching and unclenching nervously. You think it's that easy? We can try again. I can change. We can find a way. Her voice was full of desperation. I've tried, Rachel. We both tried, but it doesn't work anymore. Her face hardened. What if I don't want a divorce? She asked, looking at me defiantly. Then it'll have to go through the courts, I answered, feeling my insides clench. Her eyes widened, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. A trial? Are you really going to go that far? Yes, I said firmly, because I don't see any other way out. She was silent, her shoulders slumped, and for a moment I thought she'd given up. But then her face turned cold again. Do what you want, she said, and left the room, slamming the door loudly. Left alone, I felt a mixture of relief and pain. It was the right decision, but it was still weighing on me. A few days later, I met with a lawyer. A middle-aged woman with sharp eyes listened to my story carefully, asking questions and making notes in a notebook. We'll start by filing an application, she said. You need to be prepared for the process to take a while. I nodded, feeling the fear give way to determination. When I got home, Rachel was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea. She didn't look at me, but I knew she was waiting for news. I've applied, I said, trying to speak calmly. She set the cup on the table. Her face remained impassive, but her hands trembled. You really did it, she said quietly, more to herself than to me. We sat in silence for a long time, each in our own thoughts. It was our last night under the same roof as husband and wife. The court hearing was set for Thursday morning, and I spent the night sitting at the kitchen table, going over the papers my attorney, Amelia, had prepared. She was confident in our position, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every line in the documents reminded me of how far we'd come from where we'd started. Rachel, on the other hand, was surprisingly calm. Over the past weeks, it was as if she had resigned herself to the inevitable. Her demeanor was cold, even indifferent, but I knew it was just a mask. She had always been able to hide her true feelings. When I entered the courtroom, my heart pounded harder. The light-colored walls, the stern faces of the attorneys, and the indifferent stares of the court staff pressed in on me. Rachel was already seated at the long wooden table. She didn't look in my direction, but I could see her fingers nervously clutching the pen. It's going to be okay, Amelia said quietly, putting her hand on my shoulder. Her confidence was almost infectious, but doubts still plagued me. The trial began with formalities, introductions, readings of statements. I barely listened, trying to concentrate on what was ahead. When it was time to speak, Amelia stood up and began to state our position clearly and confidently. My client tried to save this marriage, she began, but despite his best efforts, the relationship was hopelessly broken. We will present evidence to prove the emotional distress he suffered. Rachel sat still, but I noticed her jaw tense. When Amelia mentioned the broken phone, her eyes flickered to the judge, as if she were trying to explain herself without words. The defendant exhibited disruptive behavior that not only undermined their relationship, but also emotionally damaged my client, Amelia continued. When it was Rachel's turn, her lawyer stepped forward, trying to present her in the best light. He talked about her fatigue, her difficulties at work, her efforts to save her marriage. But every word sounded strained, like a poorly rehearsed speech. The trial culminated when the judge asked Rachel to explain the phone incident. Her voice shook, but she tried to explain herself. I was on edge, she said. It was the only way I could express my pain. I didn't mean to hurt him. She was silent, as if she couldn't believe what she was saying. When all the arguments were over, the judge left to make his decision. Those 20 minutes of waiting felt like an eternity. I stared at the table in front of me, going over in my head everything that had happened in the last few months. When the judge returned, his voice was calm but firm. Considering the evidence presented, the court rules in favor of the plaintiff. The house and automobile remain in his favor. The defendant is not entitled to alimony. I felt the tension fall from my shoulders. It was a victory, but instead of joy, I felt a strange emptiness. Rachel sat with her head down. She didn't make a single movement until her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder to lead her out of the room. It's over, Amelia said, smiling at me. But it wasn't. There were still a lot of unresolved issues, but the main decision had been made. The next day, I returned to our house, now mine alone. Rachel's things were gone, leaving behind empty spaces. Her favorite mug was no longer on the shelf. Her books were gone from the bottom shelves of the closet. I walked to the window and watched a small van pull away from the house. Inside were her possessions, her memories, her part of this life. Later that evening, the phone rang. It was her parents. Marcus, her father began. We wanted to talk. I tensed, expecting accusations, but instead I heard, "We're sorry about what happened. Rachel should have done better. We wish you nothing but happiness." That call was an unexpected and strange ending to our story. I woke up the next day to an empty house. The silence was pressurizing, but there was something new in it, a hint of freedom. I realized that there were many changes ahead, but this was another chapter of my life. I didn't immediately realize that I was now living alone. The first few days after Rachel left were a blur. I walked around the house, habitually expecting to see her in the kitchen or hear the sound of her footsteps. But instead, only silence greeted me. One morning I awoke to sunlight streaming through the curtains. It was falling on the empty side of the bed where Rachel used to sleep. I ran my hand over the cold mattress and realized that this emptiness no longer caused me acute pain. There was a strange sense of peace. I decided to start the day with something new. Instead of lazily flipping through my phone, I put on my sneakers and walked outside. The frosty air burned my lungs, but it was invigorating. The run wasn't easy. I hadn't made time for sports in a while, but with each step, I could feel the unnecessary tension fading away, giving way to clarity. In my second week of solitude, I made another decision: rearrange the furniture. I turned the couch where Rachel and I watched movies so that it no longer faced the window where we often talked about the future. I moved the dining table closer to the kitchen, removing one of the chairs. Little things like that seemed to help me realize that this house was all mine now. One evening, on my way back from the supermarket, I stopped for a moment in front of a bookstore window. In the brightly lit window were books with brightly colored covers and big titles. One of them caught my eye. It was called Life from the Ground Up. I went inside and bought it. At home, sitting in silence, I immersed myself in reading. It was the story of a man who lost everything and found himself anew. Every page resonated with me, as if the author was describing my own thoughts. Things had changed at work, too. Colleagues who used to often ask questions about my family life now only cast sympathetic glances, hesitating to speak. But one day, after a meeting, a coworker named Evan came up to me. "How are you holding up?" he asked, leaning on my desk. "Not bad," I replied, trying to sound confident. "Listen, if you want to take your mind off things, me and the guys have a tradition of going to the bar after work on Fridays. Why don't you join us?" I hesitated, but decided it was worth a shot. Those Friday nights were a breath of fresh air for me. The conversations, the laughter, the stories others shared made me feel like I was part of something bigger than my own experiences. I met Claire at one of these meetings. She was the sister of a coworker who happened to stop by the bar to give him his forgotten keys. Her open smile and easy laugh instantly caught my attention. "Are you new to the company?" she asked, sitting down next to me while her brother went to get drinks. "More like just getting back into life," I replied with a smile. The conversation with her was easy, as if we'd known each other all our lives. We discussed everything: books, traveling, even ridiculous moments from childhood. It was the first time in a long time that I laughed heartily. The next day, I woke up with an unexpected feeling. Life had begun to take on a new meaning. I decided to delve into my longtime hobby of photography. I took out my camera, which had been gathering dust in the closet for years, and went to the park. Taking pictures became a meditation for me. I focused on the little things, on the play of light in the leaves, on the smiles of passers-by, on the reflection of the sunset in the water. Each shot was like a new step toward myself. One evening I got a text message. It was Claire. "Saw an amazing sunset yesterday. I'm sure you would have made a masterpiece out of it." I smiled as I read her words. It seemed that even a short text could bring warmth back into my life. Each new day brought something different. I no longer looked at the past as a burden. It was an experience that taught me to be stronger, more honest with myself and others. And although there were still many unknowns ahead, I was no longer afraid. I was ready to move forward, step by step, discovering a new life. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.